little while ago, I reviewed Full Circle as a tribute to Christopher H. Bidmead, who had died recently, with the promise of the rest of the E-Space trilogy to come. And well, here we are, quite a bit later, with the middle story, State of Decay. And Houston, we have a problem. See, State of Decay is not very interesting. It's not bad, don't get me wrong there, it's a fine, enjoyable piece. If you want some watchable Doctor Who to put on, you certainly could do a hell of a lot worse. It's just not particularly interesting or distinct. It's quite generic. Again, not necessarily an enormous problem for watching it, but it is if you're reviewing it. And well, here I am. As a rule, I try and make my reviews a minimum of 20 minutes, just because I think that's about the minimum for a genuinely analytical review, certainly that I can do. And usually that's not a problem at all. Most stories invite at least that much discussion. If I can manage to get that out of the long game, surely I can get it out of anything. And indeed, quite a few times recently I've set out to keep it at 20 minutes and it's ended up a half an hour anyway, just so I could fit in everything I want to say. But this story is posing me a bit of a challenge here, and the question is, why is it doing that? Well, it is just fine. Unspectacular and fine. Pretty much every element is fairly close to average. Some things are a bit better, some things are a bit worse. Mostly though, everything is just fine. And that's a problem because A, there are only so many ways to say that, and B, there's only so much analysis I can do of that. I'll try my best because, well, it's a bit late now, but I thought it best to explain my position before we start because, well, it's either that or I dust down my old vampire jokes, and man, they bite. Yeah, you can thank your mercies for some things. This story is, of course, in Season 18, the season of transition where the old was pretty much swept away for the new within 7 stories. New titles and music, new ideas, new companions, and soon enough, new Doctor, which combined with his tumultuous off-screen relationship with Lalla Ward, means Tom Baker's final season tends to be described as the one where he's moody and clearly not wanting to be there. And broadly that's accurate, he is moody and he clearly doesn't want to be there, but I think it's better described as the manic energy that permeated his performances in the Williams era is now gone. But I still think the twinkle in his eye is still there. He's still performing as well as he ever could. He's not less of an actor or anything like that. And in any case, that's all for a bit later. The point I'm trying to make here is that this is the season of change. Except, State of Decay is probably the worst ambassador for this, because it's probably the only story of the season that feels like it could have taken place at any point in the Tom Baker era, which makes sense, given it's an unused script that Terrance first wrote for the slot that eventually Horror of Fang Rock was broadcast in, and he simply dusted off to fill in the slot in this season. This is sometimes fairly obvious, there are notable bits where Romana's actions would make far more sense if it was Lalla, but in terms of the overall tone and feel, it's definitely striking for the Gothic era far more than the hard science fiction that Bidmead was going for. It's reported that both Dix and director Peter Moffatt were keen on emphasising the former against Bidmead's wishes, and it does work better that way, I think. It's the source of why this overall does work. The atmosphere, tension, Gothic elements, and the feeling of it being a simple but effective vampire story, while the ins and outs of the plot are probably where this falls down, and a focus on that wouldn't have really worked. But yeah, it's odd this is a story that feels least like it really belongs in the season, given it's the middle story of its flagship trilogy, i.e. the only one of the trilogy that doesn't need to focus on either setting up or concluding the full thing, and yet we end up with a story that really could have been told at any time. It involves elements from Earth, never mind just end space, and that feels like a missed opportunity, does it not? To explore something genuinely new in a new universe, and we get not only something identical to the old universe, it's literally something from it. I don't know, it feels like it was just a bit too safe, a bit too uninterested in exploring the opportunity, and therefore, maybe if that was Bidmead's concern, he had a point. So the point I'm making is, its provenance as a reuse of an old script is both a blessing and a curse. It makes it feel a bit fresh compared with the rest of the season, and Gothic Doctor Who is always a treat, but it does mean that this feels like you could colour the space black instead of green, and there's zero reason why this would be an E-space, and that's because, well, it was. But let's take a deeper look, or as deep as I can manage given the circumstances. First of all, the production, and I've already mentioned director Peter Moffatt, who you may recall also directed my last review, The Twin Dilemma, and I was not particularly complimentary about his work there. This story is a lot better, obviously the script is much better, which gives him more to work with, but there's a lot more drive to this, much better performances, and generally he handles the slow, dripping tension very well. It's still very workmanlike, it's still the film stage play approach, but frankly I think the Gothic atmosphere could have been a bit more effective. It's not at the same level as The Brain of Morbius or Pyramids of Mars in that sense, but overall he keeps things just creepy enough. As I said, it's fine. He certainly also keeps things paced well and it never gets boring, so yeah, overall for a director I think was mostly fairly weak. This is one of his better works and certainly does the story no disservice. He also had one extremely important other job, of course, but we'll get to that in a moment. The rest of the production, I think, also impresses. The soundtrack is excellent, but then they tend to be invariably so from this era. The set design is very good and definitely evoking the best of the Hinchcliffe era there, and I think the special effects are on the whole effective. There is a moment early on where it looks a bit dodgy.
Look. Detective Castle. Village dwellings huddled like ducklings round their mother.
It's only a model. Shh.
But otherwise, I think the Citadel design is quite effective, especially given time and budget, and the effects in the finale with it turning into a rocket and with the creepy giant hand, which, aside from a quick glance a bit earlier on, is actually the only thing we see of the Grey Vampire, I think actually that does it great credit. So yeah, overall, I think it's actually a very good production. The other thing to bear in mind, of course, with this story is the other thing Moffatt had to do. He had to deal with the relationships with and between actors that were, how can this be put gently, fucking disintegrating. See, part of why Tom Baker was moody and not wanting to be there was, well, they'd been doing it for so long he was really on autopilot now and clearly beginning to tire of it, that was true, but also his relationship with Lalla Ward was tumultuous to say the least, with what I think can be best described as an on-again, off-again relationship going on at the time. In this story, they were famously were not on speaking terms throughout the filming, and you can really tell. There are several scenes where they're both looking at the camera and only glancing to look at each other when they absolutely have to. And yeah, it does make some scenes feel a bit awkward, but not like scene-destroyingly so, I suppose. And Baker and Ward are good in the factors to make it feel like the Doctor and Romana seem like they aren't two people on the verge of killing each other, which is always ideal. Baker's mood also meant that he was not particularly cooperative in general, something that the directors had to deal with for most of his time on the show. Moffatt was polite but frank with him that he needed to do, well, what he was fucking told. Because Moffatt was the director and he's the actor, and director's kind of in the name, and apparently that did work. Who knows what that says about Baker, but that it was even necessary shows just how much the star wasn't enjoying this anymore. And it's probably a major factor in his decision to leave. And of course, there was also another presence that didn't help. This was Matthew Waterhouse's first story that he filmed as Adric. And while Adric is a little shit and Waterhouse wasn't really much of an actor, I do have to admit I feel a bit sorry for him. He was just a kid and clearly wasn't really ready to be flung into this situation, particularly with what was going on between his co-stars. There's also been a lot of embellishment over the years as the stories making him sound worse than he was. The famous one from the filming of Kinder, where the story was he lectured veteran actor Richard Todd on how to act, when all he really did was just make a joke with Todd, so yeah, I do feel sorry for him, and through later interviews it seems he realises how young and naive and annoying he really was. It doesn't change, and all accounts are that he was an arrogant little shit who made a mutual loathing of him the only thing Baker and Ward could agree on while filming. So yeah, juggling all of this, I'm surprised Moffatt didn't just end the pretense and come out in a black and white shirt with a whistle there and then. With all the co-stars essentially trying to kill each other, it's a miracle we got anything watchable at all, and I think it's hats off to the production team that it is such a competent result. So this leads us to the script and the source of much of the fineness that is eluding analysis. I'll compartmentalise it as best I can to go through the elements I think important because, well, you think of a better way. I'll start with the regulars, with their actors fresh on the mind, and I think one of Terrance Dicks's strengths as a writer for Doctor Who was the fact he was one of those writers who just got the show, and I think how he approaches the character of each of the Doctors he wrote for demonstrates that. This is a very quintessential Fourth Doctor. Goofy, friendly, with a spring in his step and a twinkle in his eye, but always with that sense that in a moment he will snap to all is serious, and there'll be no doubt he has what it takes to defeat a very serious threat. This is well-trodden stuff by his final season, of course, but it plays to Baker's strengths and is a very effective back-to-basics portrayal. It's not particularly complex, and it's not as if he goes through an arc or anything like that, it's just very much just, here's the Fourth Doctor in character, and with all his subtleties. Which is fine. It's fine. So what about Romana? Well, as I said, it's clear there are moments where the companion was meant to be Lalla, most jarringly for me when she decides to go with obviously dead supporting character to go and face the vampires. That's definitely a Lalla action, not really a Romana one, but on the other hand there are moments where Dix has clearly used the opportunity she presents to add to the script. Keeping her together with the Doctor for most of the story, for instance, adds a lot of opportunity for both sharp, witty interactions and a natural means of bouncing exposition off each other, feeling more natural as a discussion between two Time Lords in the know rather than open explanation. That might have been a bit more effective if it weren't for the actors not being able to do any of it while looking at each other, but there we go. Otherwise, just fairly average Romana really, authoritative and knowledgeable if sometimes a bit blinded by her biases and rounded out by being paired with a Doctor who has opposite strengths and weaknesses. Guess what word I'm going to use for this. As for Adric, Well, this was only his second story, and it had already been established in the previous one as a bit of a little shit, so why not continue the trend here? Watching him saunter into the village hall, whatever that said is, and take all of the poor people's food without much of a thanks, is getting close enough to make the audience wonder whether the great vampire devouring the universe wouldn't be a fair price to pay for getting rid of him. Dix, to his credit, does try and do something interesting with him, to try and show that he actually is as smart as that badge tells us he is, and it sort of kind of works. He gets roped into the vampire's complicated evil plan and plays along to bluff them, and yeah, it does show he's smart enough to play that situation, and the vampires never suspected a thing because, well, they're not enormously bright, it does have to be said. But it does kind of go a bit too far in making it so it's entirely believable to the audience he's a little shit who wants only to save his own skin. And the tossed off, yeah, I'm sorry I was bluffing you, feels just a bit too much like I was trying to save face in front of the Doctor and Romana. Like, fuck, what's the best excuse I can think of? Yeah, it was a bluff. Yeah, I really was on your side, even when I was snapping in your face about I'm on their side. Yeah, pull the other one, Adric. It doesn't really work as a result, but maybe that's because we expect so little from him. I have to say I do applaud the attempt to do something different with this new companion, and to explore something that honestly hadn't been tried before in that respect, unless you count Mike Yates becoming an eco-hippie at one time, but let's try and ignore that ever happened. And it is Dix taking an element that obviously was never in his original scripts and adding more to the story as a result, which I think showed his versatility as a writer. And it's always good to see a potential issue. He is a whining teenage boy as a companion you have to slot in, and turning it into a way of, well, improving might not be the right word, adding to the story, giving it more meat on the bones, so to speak. So overall, it's, where did I put my thesaurus? So what about the rest of the characters? Well, we'll get to the vampires in a moment, so the humans, what about them? Well, they're not very interesting, I'm afraid. Quite generic, simple villagers who are oppressed types are a dime a dozen throughout Doctor Who history, and not much is added. The idea of some of them having access to abandoned technology and trying to get it to work so they can fight their oppressors, it's a good idea, but it just isn't really executed right. I wish it was explored more, but it just seems to be an excuse for the humans to go, we should fight, no, we should be more careful, which is such a tired character conflict which reveals nothing about anyone involved. The question shouldn't be, what are these characters' opinions about fighting or being forward? It's, why are those their opinions? And this isn't answered. We get a bit from the guy who lost his son, but that's just a single line. He doesn't seem particularly tortured by something that should be tearing him apart. He tried to protect him, failed, and now he's lost forever, and the pure spiteful anger that should be clouding his judgment and making him more aggressive just isn't there. He's not even the one who wants to be that more aggressive, that's a different guy. And that's because, well, these are just generic personalities. They're just dull. Oh, I found something that isn't fine. Or have I? Because, well, in the end, they're just a bit dull, annoyingly so, and they work within the plot. I don't know. I will say, though, one of them had me going nuts towards the start of the story, because I kept thinking, where do I recognise that actor from? I checked Wikipedia and didn't recognise the name, and he hadn't been in anything I'd seen before, which was making me even more annoyed, until I realised it wasn't him I was thinking of. He looks a bit like Terry Jones playing the hermit in Life of Brian. You know, the one with the juniper bushes. Now, normally, such an anecdote would not make it into the full review, but here we are. Anyway, the vampires. As I can't quite remember their names, nor can I be bothered to look them up, I'm going to call them King Vampire, Queen Vampire, and Professor Vampire. I hope it's clear who I'm referring to by that. Anyway, I do really like the idea behind these guys. The crew of an ancient spaceship turned into vampires and have slowly forgotten who they were. A good overall look at the curse of the vampire. Eternal life for one way you're warped and twisted by it, turned into just a pale echo of the real person they once were. On the whole, I think this is presented quite well, aside from a bit where the Doctor goes, no, they're not the descendants, they're the real people from that time, to which the audience goes, well, yeah, that's the impression we got the whole time, why wouldn't they be? When would they have had children? But never mind. For once, it's an instance where telling us but not showing us works, because we can establish who they really are, but then their actions can show us that they're nothing like the people they once were. What they have become has consumed them. Again, to show exactly what I said, the curse of being a vampire, and why Adric would be wrong to want them to become like them anyway. Nevertheless, we see differences in personality between them that does belie their origins as, real people. King Vampire and Queen Vampire seem to have their small doubts, nothing too big, but enough that it's easy to get the impression they really are just going on with this because they have been consumed, they have so little left that they just cower in the shadow of the great vampire, they really are just all that now. While Professor Vampire seems to be enjoying himself immensely, helped of course by a delightful performance that is simultaneously very hammy and very creepy, that's given by Emrys James, which helps give the impression that this guy was maybe just a kind of a weirdo and a dick while he was a human, which is why he's so happy to be what seems the great vampire's main underling, with the other two sort of secretly under his control. But I do like that we're allowed to make these inferences. It doesn't spell it out for us because, well, that would certainly be against the spirit of the piece. Part of the power of the vampire as a construct is the mystery and the mystique. That sort of thing. Some stuff needs to be shrouded like that. So overall I think they work as villains, but what about the way the vampire stuff as a whole is portrayed? Well, I think the atmosphere and style of it is a success. It's hardly a horror movie, it's fair to say, what with the creaking of the polystyrene sets and all that, it's Doctor Who after all. But it does create an effective atmosphere, one of foreboding, that this world feels cursed and its rulers are both the curse and the cursed, and it really does create that atmosphere of dread. The idea of the choosing, whatever it's called, I can't be bothered to look it up, is another of those old cliches. We're seeing the people lined up and taken away, then seeing the creepy rulers that are going to be dominating these people. It really does give this feeling of damnation and helplessness. The performances from the vampire actors also help bring this across, the unnatural feeling, and I think the makeup actually does a good job of that as well. It looks a bit silly, but, again, it's Doctor Who. It's not a terrifying atmosphere, as I said, but what it does achieve successfully is the hammer horror feeling. Not that of genuine scares, but the good old-fashioned classic dread. The kind of thing you'd get from a mummy wrapped in tissue paper or the old-style Dracula. The kind of thing you'd expect to see Christopher Lee or Peter Cushing in. I mean, this is hardly new ground for Doctor Who, and it's not even really new ground for Dix in that respect. The Brain of Morbius and the horror of Fang Rock were both him, and they are among the best examples of it. And this story doesn't reach that level. There's something just a bit too... I won't say fine. There's something that's just a bit too basic about it. It doesn't quite reach the complexity of how it's portrayed there, but overall I do think it's quite effective and services the story very well. So finally, and yes, we're already at the finally, I told you, I didn't have much to work with here, I'll take a quick look at the plot. There are bits I like and bits I don't like. I actually quite like the connections to Old Time Lord lore, adding some stakes, pun not intended, to the situation by showing this as an enemy that the combined might of Gallifrey could only just defeat. And I even like the conclusion, actually. The Doctor realises he needs a giant metal stake to kill the Great Vampire, so he uses the Spire, which is of course a spaceship, so it'll be pilotable, and it has a big spear at the end that can kill the thing. It's quite a neat idea, and I like it when a story uses its own internal logic in that way. On the other hand, all the stuff for the humans is boring and generic, as I said, and the E-Space stuff feels tacked on because, well, it is. It definitely was a missed opportunity for this to be so linked to N-Space as it is, and there's basically nothing that really connects this to E-Space at all, other than the exposition about the CVEs, which, yeah, definitely still makes sense, Christopher. Oh, and apparently the TARDIS is more reliable at short hops in E-Space because it's smaller, which is a bit of a silly justification for something that's never needed it before. The TARDIS, at least since the Doctor has been able to control it since the early 70s, is as effective as the script needs it to be, and that's always implicit. There's really no need to lampshade or justify it. So it's up and down, but what it does manage to do is hold the interest, be entertaining, and never slow down and will become boring and annoying, and that is praiseworthy without doubt. It has its weaker bits, but overall, if you sit down just wanting to relax in front of Doctor Who, especially if you're in the mood for something a bit creepy and sort of in the horror genre, it's got good ideas and atmosphere, you'll never get bored, you could do a lot worse. Now, I think you were wondering I was going to say, like New Who there, but I would never be so predictable. You could do a lot worse like New Who. As for its place in the trilogy and in Season 18, well, it's actually not that important to either. As I said, the E-Space stuff is among its weakest aspects, and if you substitute the Simp score for a Dudley Simpson one and change the colour of the Doctor's scarf, there's not really that much that would stop this from being completely congruous with earlier seasons. It's therefore an odd place for it to sit, and says very little about Bidmead or his season, which is odd because that's how this look at the trilogy started in the first place. He died last year, I wanted to do a bit of a tribute to him, decided to do Full Circle and follow up with the rest of the trilogy, but, here we are. And I want to make it clear, it's not a criticism necessarily. Honestly, I'm not sure it is at all, because, as I said, I think the ham horror approach favoured by both the writer and the director was the better choice over the scientific gobbledygook favoured by the script editor, given the subject matter and how it was portrayed. And I do give Bidmead credit for this. Commissioning a Season 2 writer to pick up an old script that required minimal work was a good way of saving time and preventing problems. He knew Dix would be able to do it basically on his own, it wouldn't require him to come in and rescue it, and overall, yeah, I think this showed that he was actually quite good at his job, script editing. A skill that eluded pretty much all of his successors. So it fits oddly in its place in Season 18, but I can't say it's worse for it, or reflects badly on anyone involved in that respect. So that's about it really, and I'll say now the story gets a final score of 5 out of 10. It's average for Classic Who. It Entertaining, and in some places interesting. It's a fun adventure, even if it has its flaws and weaker parts. I really wish I could say more about it, but I don't know, it just sort of has no more to really talk about. K9 is in it, he does things, that's about it really. And it's all because never have I been quite so lost for words. There are really only so many ways to say the word fine. It's fine, as I said. I don't know, perhaps I'm losing my touch. Next time I'll see if I can review New Who in like a single word. The word dogshit springs to mind. Ho ho ho, funny me.